Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so actually, they gave me the title, so that's why the title is a little bit odd. Collecting naval postal covers. They'd already posted that on their website, so I just ran with it. It's a little bit about myself. I'm a logistics manager for Lam Research. Lam is a manufacturer of semiconductor capital equipment. Our equipment makes chips, and I manage our North America spares distribution network. I've been collecting stamps since I was about 6 years old. I started collecting naval covers in high school, and I'm a member of the USCS since 1995, and I've been the secretary since 1998. It's a little bit of what naval postal covers are, so we can understand what we're going to be talking about and seeing here today. A little bit of history going back to 1908. Congress authorized putting post offices aboard ships and in land stations of the Navy. Those post offices are pretty much like any post office you would have in your city. They have stamps. You could get money orders. You could mail your letters there. You could get your mail through the post office. Part of the reason they did this was, if you think back over 100 years, if you were a sailor making liberty in some foreign port, but you wanted to mail a postcard home to your wife or girlfriend or parents or whatever, you'd have to hunt up a local post office, get some local currency, and go buy some local stamps and mail it. All that took some time, kind of bit of pain. So people convinced Congress that, hey, let's put post offices on ships. And so they did in 1908. A couple of definitions, because you'll hear me say these words throughout the presentation. I'm going to abbreviate naval postal cover, and it's a naval cover. And a cover is simply no more than an envelope. And you can see a little sample down in the right-hand corner. Some of the covers will have cachets on them. Cachets are artwork. Our text is printed usually on the left side of the envelope. In this case, my little sample, the palm tree and the wording St. Patrick's Day are the cachet on this cover. Cancels are also postmarks. And in this case, you can see the USS Horn canceled this cover.
Hmm.
Term philately is the study of postage stamps. And another term you may hear me use is philatelic, which means it's relating to philately. Since those first post offices back in 1908, over 5,000 Navy ships have had post offices. That's a lot of ships. And they've used over 40,000 different postal markings. So there's a lot of markings out there that you could collect if you wanted to. People manning these post offices once upon a time are called Navy mail clerks, which sounds appropriate enough. In 1960, the Navy actually created a rating called the Navy Postal Clerk rating. And then maybe 20, 30 years ago, they eliminated that rating and they folded the postal type of operation into the rating of logistics specialists, which is what they're called today.
And another wrench that just blew.
Collectors have been sending covers to ships for cancellation since about the 1920s, so this is a fairly old hobby. I actually have a postcard that somebody sent to a ship in 1911 asking for a cancellation, so somebody was collecting way back in 1911 even. Some of the covers that we collect weren't canceled aboard ships, but we still call them naval covers. Examples of those covers, and you'll see a few in this presentation, are covers marking keel layings, marking launchings, anniversaries of a ship, and mail to a ship. A lot of different collecting interests for naval cover collectors, and some people collect a little bit of everything. Some people maybe collect just particular ships or particular ship events. Some collect ships that were associated with an event, and we're going to see a few of those. Maybe they're collected for historical reasons. Maybe they're collected for the locations the ships were in. Maybe they're collected for the artwork or the cachet on the envelope. And there's even a category called postal history where you're really studying how a cover progressed through the mail stream. And those are just some of the samples and some of the examples of why people collect naval covers. The hobby really kind of kicked off in the late 1920s. That's the first time we see some philatelic articles in journals about naval covers. Remember, the post offices were created in 1908, so it took almost 12 years, 20, 12, 15, 20 years, and kind of stamp collectors kind of started saying, geez, what are these things? We've never seen them before, even though they'd been around, and they started writing articles. A guy named Francis Locy, who was a doctor in the Navy, um, eventually became a lieutenant commander. He wrote an article in 1929 in a journal called the American Philatelist, and he proposed a system to describe these various cancels, and I'll show you that in a few minutes here. It's a system that we still use today, so he contributed a lot to the hobby. This is a picture of Locy. He was attached to the Marines. He served in World War I. He was in the 6th Regiment of Marines, which was attached to the Army's 2nd Division in France. And he received the Navy Cross for actions he did in June of 1918. And the same things they were doing back in the 20s are the same things we're doing today. They were sending for covers, and our collectors still do that today. These are some various ship cancels, just to show you how they can look very different. Upper left is from the gunboat Yorktown in 1908, so it's a very early cancel. Going clockwise, the subtender Alert, the carrier Langley, and the battleship Arizona. And just a few other examples: California, battleship California in the upper left, an amphibious force flagship, the Mount Olympus, a destroyer, USS John Paul Jones, and then a carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln. So you can see how those all look a little bit different. What Locy did was he studied his collection and covers that he got from other people, and he realized there were patterns to the cancels, and he classified them. And you see here, there's a type 1 through type 9 that he originally classified, and they all look a little bit different. And there are variations within each of these types, but in general, a type 3 cancel looks like a circle with 3 bars. A type 6 looks like a circle with a little football oval. And so this became very handy for collectors. So I could talk to anybody and say, hey, my cover has a type 3 cancel on it, and they're immediately going to have some idea of what that postmark looks like. Since he classified back in 1929, we've only had to add 3 types, a type 10, 11, and 12. You can send for covers or cancels. So covers are for collectors. It's an easy way to get a cancel in the ship's cachet, and I'll show you some examples of ship cachets. Collectors often ask for specific dates when they send in covers. Maybe they want a particular holiday for the postmark, or maybe Navy Day, or maybe Veterans Day as an example. And some ships have always been very good about servicing all the way through all the years. Some ships will be very good. You send the cover in, they'll process it, send it back to you. Unfortunately, there's other ships also through the years that just kind of pretty much refuse to do anything with your cover. So it's a little bit of a hit and miss when you do this type of collecting by sending covers in. 1930s brought a little bit of a change to the hobby. People became a little bit less interested in the cancels, but became more interested in cachets. And again, we'll see cachets in this presentation too. Cancels were still important, help you keep track of what ship a cover was from. And again, like I said, it gave you a very good way of referencing and talking to somebody else by referencing a cancel type, the other person could know what you're talking about. Shipbuilding events became popular ways to make naval covers, keel launchings, commissionings. And covers to a ship as well as to a ship kind of became, from a ship, became a little bit more collectible than they were in the past. And merchant ships kind of entered the scene. Merchant ships had postal markings, and those started becoming collectible. I'm going to show you some examples of covers that people sent for and what you could get by sending to a ship. This is actually a cover that Dr. Losey sent back in 1928. He sent it to the USS General Alava, which was a ship captured from Spain during the Spanish-American War. The U.S. Navy used as miscellaneous auxiliary. And you can see from this cancel, the wording in those killer bars says Shanghai, China. That was a way the naval mail clerk could denote where the ship was located. So this cover went to the General Alava, which was in Shanghai in 1928. Here's a submarine cover sent to the USS Triton. Triton didn't have a postmark, and you can see that this was postmarked in Portsmouth, Virginia. But the magenta ink and design you see, that's the cachet of the ship. So the ship applied that cachet. They applied the corner card up in the upper left, and the commanding officer signed this cover. Captain Bob Rollins, who was a friend of mine, signed this cover. He was the CO, one of the 3 COs for the USS Triton. This is a cover I sent for, one of the very first ones I sent for back in 1970 to the carrier USS America. You can see it has an USS America cancel and a rather plain drab looking cachet, just kind of the seal of the ship. But this is one of my oldest naval covers that I sent for. A couple of other examples, sending a couple ships, and you can see how ships would apply their cachet and maybe even apply more than one cancel to give the cover a little bit of a flair and for the collector to get examples of different cancels. This one's from the battleship Missouri. It's interesting. It's got 3 cancels on the right, January 16th, 1991. They're all different cancels. January 16th was the last day of Desert Storm. Desert Shield. The first day of Desert Storm was January 17th, and there's a cancel in the lower left for January 17th. So this is the transition from Desert Shield to Desert Storm, all on the Missouri, which is over there in the Persian Gulf. And this is a cover sent to the USS Enterprise, a fairly recent one. As we all know, the Enterprise was deactivated, decommissioned, and this was the deactivation ceremony. And the ship's mail clerk put 3 different cancels on here, as well as the cachet. The cachet is the box in the center where it says 50th anniversary. A lot of people collect from a particular ship or ship events. Sometimes there's different event covers for ships. And a real mail from a ship can have a tie into history. So I'm going to show you some examples of just collecting covers for a specific ship. So these covers I'm going to show you now are from the USS Midway. We see a launching cover, March 1945, and we see a commissioning cover, September 1945. This was real mail from a sailor aboard the Midway, 1953. During this time, the Midway was in the Mediterranean participating in something called Operation Rendezvous, which is a NATO exercise. Some more real mail, the top cover being posted in 1965 when the Midway was in Vietnam waters during the Vietnam War. Midway was in Vietnam waters 3 different tours. This is one of them. On this particular tour, the air group lost one Phantom and two Skyhawks to enemy action. Bottom cover, 1970, is just after the Midway went through a modernization period where they made a larger flight deck, improved the catapult, and did some other things to the ship. Both of those are real mail from a sailor. This one is also from one of the tours of Vietnam. This is the third tour for the Midway in Vietnam. And this one's fairly interesting. It's actually philatelic. It was being sent from somebody to a collector. And the person who sent it from the Midway actually enclosed a note. That's the yellow paper here. This one's interesting in that it was posted 4 days before the fall of Saigon. So April 26, 1975. So this is when things were falling apart in Vietnam. People were trying to get out, boat people, all that kind of thing. The yellow note says, and this must have been written after the cover was postmarked, but he says, we'd spent 60 days at sea during this operation. We picked up evacuees, many aircraft that flew out of Saigon, dropped some off in Thailand and Guam, and also picked up about 30 plus from a boat off of Thailand. He handwrites that they had over 3,000 South Vietnamese evacuees on board. Some of you may be old enough to remember that there was a South Vietnamese pilot that escaped in a Cessna Bird Dog with his family, flew over the Midway, and made every intention of saying he wanted to land. The flight deck was full at the time, and you may actually remember, I remember these. I remember seeing it on the news. The Midway crew was pushing helicopters off the side of the ship to make room for this plane to land, and you can see a picture in the lower left-hand corner of that Cessna landing aboard. That happened just 3 days after this postmark, 1 day before the fall of Saigon. And another Midway cover. This is actually during Desert Storm, 1991. Real mail. Apparently this sailor had some interest in model airplanes. And then the last one from the Midway is the decommissioning cover from the Midway. So you can see how you could just take one ship and find many different covers and make a little collection just out of one ship. Other ways of collecting covers are tying covers on ships to historical events, such as ships that were at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, ships that maybe were in Tokyo Bay for VJ Day, ships maybe in the Asiatic Fleet, ships on fleet exercises. As we've already seen, ships during Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and got a few here for Pearl Harbor. Probably all of you know the USS Oklahoma battleship. So this was canceled aboard, and a cachet marking the launching of two destroyers, the Patterson and the Jarvis. Now, all three of these ships were at Pearl Harbor, so this is kind of a three-for cover. USS California, another battleship that was at Pearl Harbor. This posted December 1st, so 6 days before the attack. USS Medusa, also Pearl Harbor. An interesting cachet with a map of the Hawaiian Islands with some notations. Notation notes that this was during fleet maneuvers and gunnery school, July and August of 1936. And then a USS Arizona cover with Arizona ties. The cachet shows the Grand Canyon. The stamp shows the Grand Canyon. And the mail clerk even put the words "See Grand Canyon, Arizona" in the killer bars. So everything about Arizona on this one cover. Ships that were at VJ Day. There were over 200 ships in Tokyo Bay on VJ Day, September 2nd, 1945. On that day, many of the ships used special cancellations. Many of the ships prepared special cachets. It's an interesting topic. Since VJ Day was a one-day affair, it's kind of hard to find covers for that date. Some of them are pretty scarce. Some of them not so scarce, but it's an interesting topic. It's one that I collect. This is a postcard that was printed aboard the USS Missouri. Shows the cancellation. Says USS Missouri, September 2nd, Japanese formal surrender. This was printed for the crew so they could mail postcard home to their family or friends. This was also mailed from the Missouri, showing a cachet with the USS Missouri, mailed from a chaplain who was aboard. Another VJ Day cover from the West Virginia. You may recognize the West Virginia was also a Pearl Harbor ship. Very attractive cachet printed on the ship's printing press office. Mailed from an ensign who took the time to hand color this one and make the cachet pretty attractive. One more from VJ Day, a destroyer, the USS Perkins. Pretty fancy cancel, reading Tokyo Bay, and a little hard to see. It's on the stamp, but it says September 2nd, 1945, Surrender Day. Couple Desert Storm covers here. This for the carrier Saratoga, which was in the Gulf, January 7th. So this is still Desert Shield. This from one of the merchant ships. There were a lot of merchant ships involved in Desert Storm, Desert Shield. Many of them had cachets. Not all of them did. Some of them just had ship's markings. This one was a little cachet from the SS Rover, which is a roll-on, roll-off merchant ship. And again, January 17th, which was the first day of Desert Storm, from the frigate USS Barbie. Historical events are another topic to collect. You can find covers that are either postmarked on a historical event or close to one. They're pretty hard to find, so when you do find one, they're pretty interesting. Real mail from a ship can tie to an event in history, so that's an interesting topic. This is an old cover. For you submarine collectors, this was the USS G2, 1918. G2 was actually one of the gasoline-powered Simon Lake design submarines, if you're familiar with those and think back to some old pictures. Postmarked at the submarine base in New London in 1918. The war was still going on at that time, so covers and mail was censored. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see it's printed passed by censor with the censor's initials there. Pretty uncommon and submarine, certainly part of the submarine history. I think we're probably all familiar with USS Squalus, submarine that was lost. This was a launch cover for the Squalus. This is what I'm guessing may very well be a one-of-a-kind cover. This cover was originally printed for commemorating the rescue of the crew from the Squalus. Some of the crew was rescued using a McCann diving chamber. The survivors signed this cover. I think all but one of the survivors signed this. There's some additional signatures on the back. I don't know any of the specifics or how this cover got created, who did it, took the time to get everybody's signatures, but I have to believe this is pretty much a one of a kind. Another historical event. First nuclear submarine launch, the USS Nautilus, 1954. And as we all know, the Nautilus made a trip under the North Pole. The crew prepared covers for that event. They prepared a cancel for that event. 1,570 covers were prepared, all by people on the crew. They weren't available for collectors. The cancel wasn't available for collectors. These were prepared strictly for the crew to mail to their friends or their family. And then at some point after that, they came into collector hands. Pretty rare cover. Submarine Thresher, another well-known submarine name. This is a launch cover, 1960, printed by the shipyard. Another well-known submarine, the USS Scorpion, commissioning cover. These were prepared by the medical officer aboard Scorpion on that day in July of 1960. Not very many were prepared. This is also a pretty rare cover. Another submarine, also pretty famous, USS Triton. Triton made the first submerged circumnavigation of the globe. They also prepared covers for the crew to be used to send to people. This is one of them. And the cancel in the upper right-hand corner was also prepared special for this voyage. USS Sea Dragon. Sea Dragon made the first Northwest Passage. Went from Portsmouth to Nome, Alaska. And this is a pretty interesting cover. It looks pretty messy. It's a cover that was mailed from a lady to her brother. It's hard to see through the crossing out and the X's, but her brother was Roy Anderson, Seaman First Class, and it was addressed to him at the Armed Guard Center in Treasure Island, California. The Armed Guard were the poor people in the Navy who were stationed aboard merchant ships, manned anti-aircraft guns and ship guns, and they manned the radio aboard merchant ships. So apparently he had moved from the Armed Guard Center, and this was something the Navy took great pride in, figuring out where people were, so it was forwarded on to him. I believe the black marking in the upper right-hand corner is the first place it was forwarded to, but I can't read it. It then got forwarded to another merchant ship on the lower right-hand corner, the SS Santa Margarita. And then from there, it went to the ship on the left-hand side, the SS Paul Hamilton. Well, the Paul Hamilton is unfortunately a famous ship. In 1944, April 1944, she was off the coast of Algiers, carrying a load of munitions and a bunch of Army Air Force personnel. Germans attacked, dropped the torpedo hit the ship, and in pretty much an instant, the ship vaporized because all the munitions aboard ship were set off. Of 580 people who were aboard that day, there was only one body ever found. And unfortunately, this sailor, Roy Anderson, was lost that day. And here's a picture of Roy, and here's a picture of his grave marker, which is in Ohio. 21-year-old kid lost that day. Another historic cover. This is D-Day, June 6, 1944. Canceled aboard the USS Augusta. The Augusta was the flagship of the Western Task Force off the coast of Normandy. And Captain Alan Kirk was the commander of the U.S. Naval Forces, and he signed this cover. A little hard to see, but it's on the left-hand side under the word France. That's his autograph. A couple of pretty historic covers here. This one's maybe a little less historic, but it's still interesting. Korea wartime. This was prepared by an ensign, Robert Schultz. He had a note in this envelope. That's why I knew a little bit about it. But he prepared these for some people on the ship. It marks the day the USS Leyte was leaving Korean waters, homeward bound back to the U.S. January 1951. And another collector cover from the Korean War. This one prepared by Lieutenant Chuck French. Chuck was a friend of mine, was a USCS member, stationed aboard the Bairoko, and he made a few of these for himself, marking the end of the Korean War, July 27, 1953. Other things to collect have to do with some of the port ships I've visited over the years. I use the word exotic because if you look at some of these port names, they just strike me as being exotic places. You wonder where they're at. You have to pull out an atlas, and sometimes even then you don't find them. Cancels recorded where ships were, so it's kind of a little bit of history. The postage recorded where the ships were. Sometimes the stamps that were used weren't U.S. stamps, and they were stamps of that particular country. And the return address sometimes showed where ships were. So these all become interesting to me, and just, where was a ship? What was it doing there? This from the cruiser Augusta, 1935. She was taking a cruise from Singapore to Borneo. And on this particular day, she was in Zamboanga, Mindanao, Philippines. And you'll have to pull out your atlas to find that one. Another Augusta, a 1936 cruise. She was in the Isle of Bali, which sounds pretty exotic to me. Northeast Indies. Not nearly as exotic, but interesting. The battleship Maryland was in LA Harbor for the 10th Olympics held in 1932, which were held in LA. This one's got a little bit of everything from the destroyer tender USS Blackhawk at Shengtao, China, and this sailor used Chinese postage and arranged it in a neat little pattern. Almost looks like a overhead view of a B-2 bomber. Kind of a nice cover, just simply mailing it. Probably, I'm sure that was probably his wife he was sending a letter to. Subtender Beaver in Hong Kong, 1929. And I'd like to know what Hong Kong was like in 1929. After having seen it in modern days, I'm sure it was a lot different in 1929. Interesting, attractive cachet, Kobe, Japan, showing Mount Fuji. And the destroyer tender Black Hawk was tied up, when we could tell because of the cancel, tied up at buoy number 21 in Kobe, Japan. Again, the cruiser Augusta. She and 4 destroyers went to Vladivostok in 1937. This cover was mailed on the day she was departing Vladivostok, and the sailor used Russian stamps and mailed this letter home to whoever this Donald was, another sailor aboard the battleship Idaho. Interesting Russian stamps. This is from the gunboat Sacramento, which was a small little ship serving in the Asiatic fleet at this time, 1939, 1938, 1939. The Sacramento was ordered home to Boston to go undergo refitting and modernization. So she sailed all the way from Shanghai, China, through the Indian Ocean, the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean, and across the Atlantic. It took her 6 months. And the crew prepared covers that look just like this, showing the route and the countries that she visited. The cachet actually extends onto the back of the cover and shows the rest of the voyage across the Atlantic up to Boston. This particular cover, February 1939, was postmarked while she was at Mali Atoll in the Maldive Islands. And the sender of this cover, if you look kind of lower center above the word Indian Ocean, you can see he circled and put some dots in there to indicate the islands and the Maldives, and that's where they were on this date. You can collect the whole series of covers showing all of her stops, and it's pretty interesting because I use the word exotic, but she went to some pretty interesting places on this cruise. Historical event covers. I define those as covers that tie into historical events. Often sailor mail, somebody's mailing something from a ship. Sometimes they're philatelic. This is sailor mail. It's from the Hornet, USS Hornet CV-8, postmark April 25th, 1942. Well, why is that historic? That was postmarked 1 week after she launched the Doolittle Raiders in their raid over Japan. On this date, she arrived back in Pearl Harbor after that exercise. Another Hornet cover, May 27th, 1942. It was mailed from a pilot in Bombing 8 who was stationed aboard the Hornet. This was posted one day before sailing for the Battle of Midway. This particular pilot took part in the battle on June 4th. The Bombing 8 attacked the fleet. And one more Hornet from another person in BB-8, Bombing 8. Also postmarked aboard the Hornet, this one 3 months before the Hornet was sunk in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. This sailor, unfortunately, was killed in that sinking. And the cruiser Northampton. This cover is historic because it was postmarked only 6 days before the ship was sunk off of Guadalcanal. And for our submarine fans, this is a letter from Admiral Lockwood. He sent a lot of mail to his wife, and she saved the covers, and they have made it into collector hands. That's his autograph or signature in the upper left-hand corner. That's his wife, Mrs. Lockwood, and he censored the cover himself. He was able to do that as an officer. This cover from 1943. General Motors and I think some other companies in World War II were good enough, if you want to use those words, to provide free cigarettes to both sailors and soldiers. When they gave the free cigarettes, they also provided little cards, and we call these cigarette cards. And the cards were able to be used by the recipient to send it back saying, yes, I got your cigarettes, thank you. This one's from the USS Trigger. Trigger was a sub that made many patrols during World War II. This one's from the commanding officer, Commander Halfinger. And this sub, you may know, was lost about 9 months later in March of 1945. A little more modern cover, but still historic. The second U.S. Hornets, CVS-12, was the recovery ship for both Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. This is a recovery cover for Apollo 12. Many nuclear subs have gone to the North Pole for exercises. They're generally called ISEX. This was ISEX 1996, and the submarine USS Sandlands was up there. This cover was carried on that voyage, and the name and signature over on the left-hand side denotes that this was at the North Pole on July 12, 1996, signed by the technical director of the Arctic Submarine Lab. So this is historical. Talked about cliches earlier. Covers kind of provided a medium for artists. And sometimes the artists weren't necessarily naval collectors, but they found a way to use naval covers to express their naval artistic talents. Art was used for printed cliches. Some were hand-drawn. I think some of them are beautiful works of art, and many of them are just one-of-a-kind type of covers. These are covers made by a guy named Henry Steinmetz. He often used a printed cachet, which you can see on the left-hand side of both of these covers, but he also often applied stickers, and that's what you can see here, the picture of George Washington and the eagle and flags, and the picture of the cherub and the rose were various stickers that he applied. He also often put borders underneath the stamps. And on the bottom one, that's actually gift wrapping paper that he used, the blue, green, and red wrapping paper. A guy named Gao Ing prepared a lot of naval covers. He was a naval cover collector. He did artwork. He hand drew covers. These are hand-drawn covers. Primarily, he did this for submarines, did it for a few other ships, but primarily submarines. Upper left is for the USS Sailfish when she was commissioned. We talked about the Squalus earlier. After the Squalus was raised, she was refurbished and renamed Sailfish. So this cover ties to that one. And the lower right corner is a USS Sailfish decommissioning cover from Gowing. Some people did some pretty wild artwork. Lorraine Carlson prepared these covers. The upper left was canceled aboard the nuclear cruiser USS Long Beach, signed by the captain. It's his autograph underneath the cancel, Captain Wilkinson. Below that, we have a cover canceled in Honolulu, talking about Fleet Admiral Nimitz with a picture of him, and that's his autograph underneath the picture. Don't know how she got these signatures, but they make for pretty neat covers. The two upper right ones have to do with a guy named Captain Herb Rommel. He was a USCS collector and a president of USCS. He was the CEO of the repair ship Amphion, which is the top cover. The middle one shows a picture of him. And then the bottom, we have an election cover with two naval officers who were running for president in 1960. A guy named Ralph Lewis hand painted some wonderful covers, in my opinion. We have Battleship California, Battleship Oklahoma, Battleship Texas, and the cruiser Chicago. All were cancels, 1941. And just to me, beautiful paintings by Ralph Lewis on these covers. These are a little bit different, but certainly very artistic and very attractive in my opinion. George Bromley Jr. was a sailor stationed aboard several different ships, and it seemed like he often wrote his wife, and he liked to draw pictures of ships on his covers. The ships were merchant covers, passenger cruisers. I suspect you could probably, if you did a little bit of research, you could actually figure out what every one of these ships were, because he seemed to go to great care drawing them and putting the correct colors on smokestacks. Very, very pretty in my opinion. This was just for his own personal use, mailing letters to his wife. And another guy named Carl Lewis prepared some very pretty covers. He painted these, hand painted. These are generally one of a kind. This one's canceled aboard the cruiser Astoria in Yokohama, Japan. And one last topic I'll talk about is postal history. Postal history is really more of an interest in the postal rates or the postal stamps or the markings on covers, but they are still related to Navy. They're definitely part of history, and they're usually non-philatelic mail. This is what's known as a folded letter. It's from March of 1849. It's mailed to a midshipman aboard the Rosie USS Independence. And you can see the address was crossed out. So the way this letter worked was the sender paid all of 5 cents to mail it from Albany, New York to Brooklyn, New York. It went through the U.S. Naval Lyceum, which was an organization which would forward mail on to sailors. The bottom portion of this folded letter, you can see a rubber stamp that says USN Naval Lyceum. And they knew that this midshipman was no longer aboard the Independence. He was on the store ship USS Erie. So it got crossed off and sent on, forwarded on to him aboard the Erie. 1849 is pretty old. So this one's certainly postal history related. You got markings, you got postmarks, you got the 5-cent postage, a lot going on for this little cover. Another postal history is official mail from the USS Independence when she was a receiving ship. So the same ship the other cover was addressed to became a receiving ship at Mare Island. This one's dated 1891. This was a cover sent to a lieutenant aboard the Monitor USS Dictator. Monitor was one of those single turret monitors like you would see from the Civil War period. You can see the postmarks Pinyin, New York, but it doesn't have a date. A little bit of research says this lieutenant was stationed aboard only in 1876 and 77, so we can date this cover to that period at least. Again, a little bit of postal history. And one last cover. This is commercial stationery available for purchase and available for use. This was used by a sailor aboard the cruiser Helena at Pearl Harbor, January 1941, mailed via air. Airmail at that time was going by something we call clippers, Pan Am airline China clippers, California clippers. So part of what you can do for postal research on this is you can actually track down the flight and the dates that that flight left Honolulu and when it arrived in San Francisco. My advice on if you're going to collect naval covers, start with some focus and then expand later on. Pick a topic that you're interested in. Later on, you might want to specialize, or maybe you want to become a generalist. Remember that some covers out there are going to be very plentiful, but others are going to be very, very rare. Don't be afraid to expand your interest. I think that's what keeps my interest in this hobby going. I change my interest maybe every 5 years or so, and my focus every 5 years, and keeps me going. I'd like to thank a couple of people because some people have really kept me going in this hobby. My Uncle Dave got me started way back when I was 6, interested in stamps. My mom and dad have supported me for years in this hobby, and they really helped me when I was young and helped me send for covers and bought me stamps and all that good stuff. Captain Bob Rollins was a very good friend of mine, a fellow collector. He was a mentor to me, taught me a lot about the hobby, expanded my interests, and another collector friend, Steve Kovacs, has also done the same. A lot of education from Steve. He's an expert on a lot of topics, and he's helped me find some very good covers. If you're interested in naval covers, I would suggest you go to the USCS website, www.uscs.org. We have a offer there. You can get a free trial membership for 3 months. We'll send you a PDF for 3 different months showing you our journal. You might consider joining USCS. We do have a monthly journal. We have member-only auctions. And 2 other places you can find us. You can find us on Facebook, and we have a YouTube channel where you can find presentations and interesting topics about naval history and naval covers. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for attending this symposium, and I will take questions later.